Let's talk a bit about individual learning in animals. We're going to be talking about both individual and social learning, but we're going to start with individual learning. We're going to talk about Tinbergen again, Nico Tinbergen and his 4 different ways of approaching animal behavior. Remember, he grouped those 4 different kinds of questions into 2 major categories, proximate and ultimate causes of behavior. We had been talking about the proximate cause of behavior of mechanism, or also called immediate stimuli. The other proximate cause of behavior is development, looking at how behavior develops over the lifetime of an animal. The reason I bring this up is because learning, whether it's individual or social learning, is a key part of the development of behavior. So anybody who's doing a learning study, looking at how animals learn things, learn new behaviors, is really asking a developmental question or a proximate type of question. Now we have 2 different kinds of learning, individual and social, and we're starting with a discussion of individual learning here. To start with, we've got to come up with some kind of definition of learning. There are many different definitions, but the one we are going to start with is a pretty simple one. The learning definition we'll use is an enduring change in behavior as a result of experience. And enduring just means lasting, but not necessarily forever. So we wouldn't say a permanent change, because you can learn something and forget it. Right? So an enduring change in behavior as a result of experience. Enduring change or a lasting change is important here because if you see a change in behavior, but then you don't continue to see that change, we wouldn't say somebody learned something. For example, if I touch my hand to a hot stove and pull my hand away saying, "Ooh, ow, that really hurt," but I go right back and lean on that stove again, the change in behavior, the not touching the stove because it's hot, didn't last, right? I lean into it again and burn myself again. We would not say that I learned that the stove is hot, right? So that's why I'm saying the change in behavior has to last for a while to say that it is truly learning. If it doesn't last, you didn't learn anything. The other half of this is the change in behavior as a result of experience, right? The example I always use for this comes from humans, but it would apply to animals as well. Imagine that you have a little brother who's pretty short, right? So he can see where the cookie jar is in the kitchen, but he cannot reach it because he's short. Now imagine that he has a growth spurt over summer, right? Lots of kids will have this. And suddenly he goes from trying to reach the cookie jar, but he can't get it, to being taller. So he can reach the cookie jar and he gets a cookie out of the jar. We wouldn't say, "Oh, my brother just learned how to get the cookies out of the cookie jar." No. Yes, he has a change in behavior. He now can get a cookie. But the change in behavior isn't as a result of experience. He didn't learn something new to get those cookies. He just got taller, right? So we wouldn't call this an example of learning to get cookies. You just are now able to get them because of physical maturation, right? You've just gotten taller. On the other hand, let's imagine again, little brother, too short to get the cookies. One of his cousins comes for a visit. And when the cousin is there and they're not being supervised, cousin slides over a kitchen chair, climbs onto the kitchen chair, and opens the jar of cookies. If your brother then, next day, next week, still too short to reach the cookie jar, but he slides the chair over, climbs on it, steals a cookie, we would say there that he learned how to get cookies out of the jar, right? He has changed his behavior, slides the chair over, climbs on it. In this case, though, it is as a result of experience. He experienced his cousin doing this maneuver, right, to be able to sneak a cookie, and he has now adopted it. Now, this would be an example of social learning. He learned it by watching his cousin. So we'll talk more about social learning later. But it goes to this idea of learning. There needs to be a change in behavior because of some kind of experience you had. We're starting with how individuals learn, meaning how can an individual learn a thing by themselves, even if they're not with any other social animals, right? The simplest kind of individual learning is single stimulus experience. And by the way, I think a lot of this individual learning might be review for you guys because you would have talked about it in conditioning and learning or even general psych. Single stimulus experience just means an animal is exposed to one kind of stimulus over and over again. That stimulus could be something simple or complex. If the animal changes their reaction to that stimulus because they've been exposed to it multiple times, we would say their behavior has changed due to learning. The example they give in your textbook is of a rat who has this blue bar put into its cage. And maybe we put this blue bar into the cage every single day. The blue bar is a single stimulus, kind of a boring basic one. And learning could lead the rat to either become more sensitive to that stimulus, more reactive to it, right? Maybe it becomes more curious. Maybe it spends more time handling it. Maybe it hides from it, but it in some way becomes more reactive over time. That's one possibility. Or the rat could become less sensitive to it, meaning they look at it even less. They get less curious about it. They spend less time handling it, or maybe they don't cower in fear from it. They just don't react to it as much. These are two different possibilities, and we have names for these. The first one, if an animal continues to interact with a single stimulus over and over again and it becomes more reactive to it, we would call that sensitization. You are becoming more and more sensitive to its presence. And remember, sensitization could mean I like it a lot, so I spend a lot more time interacting with it, or I'm more afraid of it, so I try and avoid it. Either of those would be an example of sensitization, because in a way, I'm becoming more reactive to the thing every time I interact with it. The other kind of response, where you become less reactive to it, you either start to ignore, mostly you start to ignore it, and you ignore it more and more. You kind of notice it more and more. You react to it less and less with time, would be called habituation, right? If you become habituated to a thing, you're getting used to it. You're treating it as just part of the background. You are not reacting to it as much as you did the first time you encountered it. Humans show habituation and sensitization to stimuli all the time, depending on whether the stimuli is useful, harmful, or neutral. Animals do as well. This kind of learning is something that we do without thinking about it much. Animals are probably doing it without thinking about it very much either. That habituation piece is particularly important when it comes to wanting to study animal responses to things in the lab. Now, let me give you an example that's also in your book. And this is an example of habituation as a problem. So here we have two fish tanks. One of the fish tanks has a typical predator fish in it, and the other fish tank has typical prey fish in it. Now, these predator and prey fish, if they were out in the, quote, real world, if they were out in a lake, the predator fish would be a danger to these prey fish. That's why we call it a predator and prey, right? It's entirely possible that you, as an animal behavior researcher, want to understand the response of prey animals to a predator. We call this anti-predator behavior. And there's a lot of really interesting anti-predator behavior to be seen in animals. So this is a really common thing to want to study. Let's say you don't want to study it out in a lake. That's really hard to do. It's hard to watch fish behave out in a lake. Much easier, if you can do it in a lab. So you bring your fish in, you put them in an aquarium, and you expose them to a predator and see how they react. And because they're in a small, well-lit aquarium, you can just see their behaviors a lot better. But you might not want your prey fish actually to be in danger, right? If you put the predator fish in the same tank with the prey, they're going to hurt some of them or eat some of them. And maybe that isn't what you want. You want to keep your study species really safe, all of your subjects safe, that they're not getting eaten all the time, either because ethically you don't want to put them in danger, or just for more practical reasons, you don't have to keep buying fish or catching them from the wild. So one way you could do this is to put the predator in its own separate fish tank, but you put them right next to each other so your prey fish can see the predator fish, right? Because often these aquariums are going to have all glass walls. Well, let's think about that single stimulus response kind of learning. So we have our tank of prey fish. We add in a predator in its own tank. First time you do this, you may see the prey fish, the prey fish may see the predator and react the way they typically would to a predator, whether that's swimming away and hiding, swimming away as fast as they can, whether it's hiding behind some stuff in your aquarium, I don't know, whatever their anti-predator behavior is. But notice what happens. They see a predator, they flee, nothing happens, right? The predator cannot get them. The predator cannot chase them. So if you on day 2, put the predator right next to them. Day 3, put the predator next to them. Day 4, put the predator next to them. This is like our single stimulus response where you're interacting with the same stimulus every single day. You could become sensitized or you could become habituated. Because the predator never gets into your tank as a prey fish, you are likely to habituate to its presence. You're likely to become less and less reactive because there is no consequence to not reacting, right? This predator fish is never going to get you. And what we end up seeing is really abnormal behavior. As they kind of have drawn in here, we've got on our drawing, our little prey fish are in fact swimming up towards the predator. Because why not? It gives him something to look at, but he poses absolutely no threat. This is not necessarily a, quote, normal behavior. This isn't what we would see in the wild. But if I want to study anti-predator behavior in these fish, I might see this and think, wow, turns out these fish don't react to a predator. They swim right up to it. Well, that's weird. How do they survive? Well, the way they survive is they don't have a glass wall between them and a predator out in the wild, so they wouldn't do this sort of behavior, right? It means that it's a problem for collecting meaningful behavioral data for research. If you really want to understand their behavior, you got to make sure they don't become habituated. This actually also has a problem for a practical application as well. There are a number of fish populations that in the wild have really decreased. Think things like trout or salmon that we've maybe overfished. So what we're doing now is trying to farm raise some of these fish in order to release them back into the wild. So there are some where we will get them as eggs or as very young babies, and we can protect them a lot better than they're going to be protected in the wild. We said before that sometimes fish will lay thousands or tens of thousands of eggs, and sometimes only hundreds of them will survive to adulthood. We can get higher numbers than that if we're farm raising them because we can keep them protected from stuff, make sure they're well fed, that there's no, fungus or bacteria in the area. So that's all good. But think about what happens as they get a little bit older. Often we'll have them in these big stock tanks, either above or in the ground, and we're going to have to feed them. Traditionally, what would happen is we'd have a time of day where we either have an auto feeder that's mounted on the side of the tank that drops in food, or we just have a person, right? Very low tech, whose job it is to walk up to the tank and toss in food. And if it's either way on a timer or a person, it probably happens at about the same time of day. Okay, so every day we've got our single stimulus. Let's say it's a person with a bucket of food. Every day at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, it's my job to walk up to the stock tank, take this bucket of food, dump it in the stock tank so the fish can eat, right? So I walk up to the edge, dump in the food, walk up to the edge, dump in the food. I am the single stimulus. Over time, do you think that those fish get habituated and start ignoring my presence? Or do they become more sensitive to my presence and react differently? They're probably going to become sensitized, but is that sensitization going to shoo them away so that they avoid me, or are they actually going to come towards me? Probably they're going to come towards me because I'm feeding them, right? So the fish closest to me maybe gets a little extra food. So we've now created this whole set of fish who, when they see a big, dark, looming figure from above, they will swim towards it because it's me providing them food with a bucket. When it's time to release those fish into the wild, what's going to happen? Is it going to be a person walks up to the side of the river or lake to feed them, so they should come towards? Probably not, right? When they're out in the wild, a big looming figure at the side of the river is potentially a predator hoping to catch them. So if we have conditioned them to swim towards whatever big looming figure there is at the side, they've become sensitized and they like it, this is also a problem, right? We have now set them up for failure. People who raise these farm-raised fish to be released into the wild are realizing this. Like, we're figuring some of this stuff out. And so one of the ways they've tried to solve this is to create systems where the food can be released from below. Many of these kinds of fish really should be looking for their food at the bottom of a river or a lake. So if we can find a way that food just gets released from below into the water, they're going to have more natural behaviors of digging and rooting through whatever's below to try and get that food source. So they're trying to work on ways to release the food so it's not just setting them up to go swim towards any big looming figure that they see on the edge of a tank, a river, or a lake, right? Okay, so single stimulus learning, there's one kind. Two more kinds I want to talk about, but not very much because you guys know about these already. Next one is classical conditioning. I want you to make sure that you could tell me about classical conditioning. I'm not going to go over a lot of it because it's such review for you guys. I don't want to waste your time. If you haven't thought about classical conditioning for a while, check out your textbook, pages 125 to 127, and they'll review it there. Make sure you know the famous name. Here's a clue. It's Pavlov, right? He did a lot of our classical conditioning work. Make sure you're familiar with how it works and the key terms, right? So here we've got Pavlov set up doing his classical conditioning studies with dogs. This is where you're going to need to know about the conditioned and unconditioned stimulus and conditioned and unconditioned response. It should not surprise you that animals do classical conditioning. I know that we learn about it for people, but look, the study was done with dogs, right? We're already using animals to do this study in the first place. So probably not too much of a surprise that classical conditioning is something that animals do as a type of individual learning. Same is true for operant conditioning, right? Classical and operant conditioning really go well together. So again, just make sure that you are comfortable and familiar with operant conditioning. If it's been a while, go look at pages 130 and 131 in your textbook and they'll give you a review. Probably the most famous name here is Skinner. You're going to want to make sure that you're comfortable understanding how learning through operant conditioning works as well. Key terms here are going to be reinforcement and punishment and positive and negative, right? We put those together to have positive reinforcement, positive punishment, negative reinforcement, and negative punishment. You want to make sure you understand what all four of those different kinds of learning conditions are. Okay, we're going to stop there for the moment and pick up next time also with some individual learning in animals, but instead of talking about how it's done, we're going to talk a little about why it's done, the purpose of learning.